In today's class, we're going to work through a TOEFL listening practice test. First, I'll give you an overview. Then you'll have the chance to practice, and finally, we'll walk through the correct answers together. Okay, let's begin with a quick overview of TOEFL listening. On test day, you'll hear 3 lectures and 2 conversations and answer a total of 28 questions. In today's practice test, you'll hear 1 lecture and 1 conversation and answer a total of 11 questions. Here's an example of a listening section. You can see a photo of the person or people you'll be listening to. And as the audio plays, you can see the play bar at the bottom. As you listen, you should take notes. Then after you listen, you'll get each question in turn. You can see that this is a multiple choice question with 4 answer options, and it says select 1 answer. This is the most common question type, but you may see one that says select 2 answers or even select 3 answers. Or you may see another question format. For example, this table format, where you click in the cells to select the relevant options. And once you've answered a question, you just click Next to move on. For today's practice test, you're going to hear a conversation between a student and an administrator in the University Employment Office, and that'll be followed by 5 questions. And then you'll hear part of a lecture in a European history class and answer 6 questions. Remember, you hear the full audio once only, so you must take notes as you listen. Feel free to pause the video if you need extra time to answer the question. So, are you ready? You can start now.
Listen to a conversation between a student and an administrator in the University Employment Office.
Hi, I hope you can help me. I just transferred from Northeastern State University near Chicago.
Well, welcome to Central University. But Chicago's such a great city. Why'd you leave?
Everyone asks that. It's my hometown, and it was sure convenient to go to a school nearby. But Northeastern is still fairly small, and it doesn't have the program I'm interested in. See, I want to major in international studies, and the only program in the state is here.
We do have a great program. Well, how did you get interested in international studies?
Well, my family hosted a few foreign exchange students while I was growing up. Then I took part in an international summer program after I graduated from high school. I found I really liked meeting people from all over, getting to know them.
Oh, okay. And that led you to our program. Right now, though, I assume you're looking for a job.
Yeah, a part-time job on campus. I thought I'd save money, being away from the big city, but it doesn't seem to be working that way. Anyway, I'm not having much luck.
I'm not surprised. Most of our campus jobs are taken in the first week or 2 of the semester. What work experience have you had?
Well, I worked in the university library last year, but I already checked at the library here. They said their remaining positions were for work-study students getting financial aid. I've never run into that before.
Well, I guess each school has its own policies. We really don't have much right now. You might be better off waiting until next semester. If you really want something, how are your computer skills?
About average, I'd say. I help teach some of the basic computer classes Northeastern offers for new users, if that helps any.
Okay. The Technology Support Department needs people to work at its help desk. It's basically a customer service job. Answering questions, helping people solve their computer problems, give you a chance to develop your people skills.
Something every diplomat needs. But is there some problem? I mean, why is the job still open?
Well, they have extended hours from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. every day, so they need a large staff. But right now, they only need people early mornings, late nights, and weekends. You'd probably end up with a bit of everything rather than a regular spot. On the bright side, you'd probably be able to get some studying done between calls. At least it'd be a start, and then you can try for better hours next semester.
I see where the hours might be a problem. But I guess I can't afford to be too picky if I want a job. Still, maybe we can work something out.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
We really don't have much right now. You might be better off waiting until next semester. If you really want something,
Why does the woman say this?
if you really want something,
Listen to part of a lecture in a European history class.
In order to really study the social history of the Middle Ages, you have to understand the role of spices. Now, this might sound a little surprising, even a little strange, but what seem like little things now were back then actually rather big things. So, first let's define what a spice is. Technically speaking, a spice is part of an aromatic plant that is not a leaf or herb. Spices can come from tree bark, like cinnamon, plant roots, like ginger, flower buds, like cloves. And in the Middle Ages, Europeans were familiar with lots of different spices, the most important being pepper, cloves, ginger, cinnamon, mace, and nutmeg. These spices literally dominated the way Europeans lived for centuries, how they traded, and even how they used their imaginations. So, why this medieval fascination with spices? We can boil it down to three general ideas, briefly. One was cost and rarity. Two was exotic taste and fragrance. And third, mysterious origins and kind of mythical status. Now, for cost and rarity. Spices aren't native to Europe, and they had to be imported. Spices only grew in the East Indies, and, of course, transportation costs were astronomical. So spices were incredibly valuable, even from the very beginning. Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time. By the Middle Ages, spices were regarded as so important and expensive they were used in diplomacy, as gifts by heads of state and ambassadors. Now, for the taste. The diet then was relatively bland compared to today's. There wasn't much variety, especially the aristocracy, who tended to eat a lot of meat. They were always looking for new ways to prepare it, new sauces, new tastes, and this is where spices came in. Now, this is a good point to mention one of the biggest myths about spices. It's commonly said that medieval Europeans wanted spices to cover up the taste of spoiled meat, but this isn't really true. Anyone who had to worry about spoiled meat couldn't afford spices in the first place. If you could afford spices, you could definitely afford fresh meat. We also have evidence that various medieval markets employed a kind of police to make sure that people didn't sell spoiled food. And if you were caught doing it, you were subject to various fines, humiliating public punishments. So what actually was true was this. In order to have meat for the winter, people would preserve it in salt, not a spice. Spices actually aren't very effective as preservatives. And throughout winter, they would eat salted meat. But the taste of the stuff could grow really boring and depressing after a while. So the cooks started looking for new ways to improve the taste, and spices were the answer. Which brings us to mysterious origins and mythical status. Now, the ancient Romans had a thriving spice trade, and they sent their ships to the east and back. But when Rome collapsed in the 5th century and the Middle Ages began, direct trade stopped. And so did that kind of hands-on knowledge of travel and geography. Spices now came by way of the trade routes, with lots of intermediaries between the producer and the consumer. So these spices took on an air of mystery. Their origins were shrouded in exotic travels. They had the allure of the unknown, of wild places. Myths grew up of fantasy lands, magical, faraway places made entirely of food and spices. Add to that, spices themselves had always been considered special or magical, not just for eating, and this was already true in the ancient world where legends about spices were abundant. Spices inspired the medieval imagination. They were used as medicines to ward off diseases and mixed into perfumes, incense. They were used in religious rituals for thousands of years. They took on a life of their own, and they inspired the medieval imagination, spurred on the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, when famous explorers like Columbus and da Gama and Magellan left Europe in their ships. They weren't looking for a new world. They were looking for spices. And we know what important historical repercussions some of those voyages had.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.
Why does the professor say this?
And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.
Well done! You've completed the TOEFL listening practice test. How did you think you went? Let me know in the comments. If you'd like more information on the TOEFL listening section, head to e2language.com and watch detailed methods lessons giving you all the tips and strategies to master TOEFL listening on test day. Let's now go over the answers to find out how you did. Okay, question 1 says, why does the student go to the university office? This is a gist purpose question. The first option says, to apply for a position at the university library. Let's look at the transcript of the recording. The student says, I worked in the university library last year, but I already checked at the library here. They said their remaining positions were for work-study students getting financial aid. So he's already found out that he's not eligible for a position in the library, so that first option is incorrect. The next option says, to get information about hosting an exchange student. The student says, my family hosted a few foreign exchange students while I was growing up. But that's not the same as saying they want information about hosting an exchange student now, so that can't be correct. The next option says, to find out if there are any jobs available on campus. And the recording said, I assume you're looking for a job. Yeah, a part-time job. So this answer is correct. And the final option says, to find out the hours of the computer lab. But the student doesn't ask the administrator about this, so this option is also incorrect. Question 2 says, why did the student transfer to Central University? This is a detail question. The first option is to take advantage of an academic program. The student says their old university doesn't have the program I'm interested in. I want to major in international studies, and the only program in the state is here. So we can see that this matches. This must be the correct answer. Let's check the other options just to make sure though. The next option is to participate in a student exchange program. Again, earlier the recording said that my family hosted a few foreign exchange students while I was growing up. But this isn't given as a reason why the student transferred there. The next option is to attend a smaller university than the one he was at before. We can see that the student did say, Northeastern is still fairly small. So he does mention the size of the university being small, but he doesn't give this as a reason for moving there. Then the final option is to benefit from Central University's international reputation. We could hear the student mentioning international studies, and the administrator said, we do have a great program. Is that the same as saying the university has an international reputation? No, it's not. Be careful when it comes to detail questions. Sometimes some of the options have similar words to what's mentioned on the recording, but don't be distracted by this. Be sure to check if the details are exactly the same to help you rule out the incorrect options. Question 3 says, why does the student mention hosting foreign exchange students? This is an organization question because the answer relies on the organization of information in the recording. For example, the student says, my family hosted a few foreign exchange students while I was growing up, in response to a question from the administrator asking, how did you get interested in international studies? The first option says, to explain his interest in a particular field of study, and we can see, because of the organization, that this option is correct. The next option says, to explain why he is looking for a job so late in the semester. But there's no connection in the passage between the foreign exchange program and his search for a job. The next option is, to explain why he would like to be an exchange student the following year. But the student doesn't mention that he wants to do this. And the final option is, to explain how he learned his computer skills. But he doesn't say he learned these from a foreign exchange student, so there's no connection there. Question 4 asks, what can be inferred about students who apply for the open position at the Technology Support Help Desk? So this is an inference question. It's asking for something you can gather from the text without it being stated directly. The first option is, they must be enrolled in a computer course. Well, the recording did say the job is helping people solve their computer problems, but the administrator didn't say he needs to be enrolled in a computer course, so this doesn't seem to be correct. The second option says they will only be able to work on weekends, but the audio says they need people early mornings, late nights, and weekends. So that can't be right. The third option says they are willing to work many hours each day they work. The administrator did say that they have extended hours, meaning the help desk is open for extended hours. But she said the student would only be doing a bit of everything, so there was no mention of them working for many hours per day. Finally, we have they are willing to work irregular hours. Again, we can see it says they need people early mornings, late nights, and weekends, and these are irregular hours, so that option must be correct. We can also infer that such hours are irregular because she says you can try for better hours next semester. So this confirms our answer. Question 5 says, why does the woman say this? So this is a function question, asking the function of what was said. And then we get a replay of the audio saying, we really don't have much right now. You might be better off waiting till next semester. If you really want something, and we need to know why the woman says, if you really want something. Well, she's trying to warn the student that the job she's going to suggest is not a very appealing option. The first option says, to dissuade the student from starting a job right away. The administrator's warning is more about the job she's going to suggest than when to start a job, so that's not correct. The next option is to suggest looking for an off-campus job, but she's giving a warning rather than a suggestion. Next, we have to imply that the student might not like the job that is available. This fits with the warning that she's giving that the job is only an option if they are really intent on getting a job, despite it being unappealing. So this is correct. Okay, that's all the questions done for the conversation recording. How did you go? Did you get many right so far? Let's move on to the answers to the questions based on the lecture. Question 6 asks, what is the main purpose of the lecture? So this is a gist purpose question. The purpose for giving a lecture is usually set out at the beginning. Let's take a look at what the professor says. She says, in order to really study the social history of the Middle Ages, you have to understand the role of spices. Can you see which option this matches with? That's right, it's the second option, to explain the significance of spices for medieval society. The professor goes on to give 3 main reasons for the fascination with spices at this time. So we know this option is correct. While elements of the other options are covered, like the use of spices in cooking, these aren't the main purpose of the lecture. Question 7 is a slightly different looking question. It's a connecting content question. It says, based on the lecture, indicate whether each of the following is true about spices in medieval Europe. And then you have a table with various options for which you have to select yes or no according to whether they're true. The first option is, they had to be imported. Close to the beginning of the lecture, the professor says, spices aren't native to Europe and they had to be imported. So the answer to this one is yes. The next option says, they were unaffordable for many people. And the professor talks about them being incredibly valuable and so important and expensive. So that's a yes too. The next option says, they were used to preserve meat during the winter. But the professor says, in order to have meat for the winter, people would preserve it in salt, not a spice. So that answer should be no. The next option is, they were believed to have medicinal properties, and the professor says, they were used as medicines to ward off diseases. So this is another yes. And finally, we have, their sale in public markets was closely regulated. The professor says, various medieval markets employed a kind of police to make sure that people didn't sell spoiled food, and mentions fines and punishments. Does that support this option? Well, it's talking about markets being regulated, but regulated in the sale of spoiled food rather than spices. So that's a no. Question 8 says, what 2 factors explain why medieval Europeans did not use spices to cover the taste of spoiled meat? This is a detail question, and note that you had to select 2 answers here. The first option given is, fresh meat was less expensive than spices were. The professor says, if you could afford spices, you could definitely afford fresh meat. So this option is correct. The next option says, spices were mainly used in incense and perfume. The lecture does mention spices being used in incense and perfume, but also covers lots of other uses, so this one isn't correct. The third option is, the sale of spoiled food was prohibited. Prohibited means not allowed, and we can see that the professor says, various medieval markets employed a kind of police to make sure that people didn't sell spoiled food. So this is correct. And finally, there's, salt was cheaper than most spices were. But no comparison is given between the cost of salt and spices, so this isn't supported by the passage. I'd just like to give a word of warning here. You must make sure you answer the questions based on the information in the recording. It may be that you know that salt was cheaper than spices, so you may want to select that as correct. But if the information isn't supported by the passage, then you shouldn't select it. Because in this case, 2 other options were supported by the recording, so those were the correct answers. Let's move on to question 9. It's an organization question, and it says, why does the professor mention the collapse of the Roman Empire? The first option is to indicate that the spice trade became more direct. But the professor says that when Rome collapsed, direct trade stopped. So we know this one can't be right. The next option is to explain why the price of pepper suddenly increased. But the price of pepper isn't mentioned in relation to the collapse of Rome. The next option says to indicate that spices were not available in Europe for centuries. But the professor says spices now came by way of the trade routes, so spices were still available. And the final option is to explain why the origins of spices became more mysterious. And the professor says, so these spices took on an air of mystery. Their origins were shrouded in exotic travels. They had the allure of the unknown, of wild places. So this is the correct option. Next is question 10. This is a detailed question. It asks, what does the professor say about European explorers during the Age of Discovery? Let's check what the professor says. She says, when famous explorers like Columbus and da Gama and Magellan left Europe in their ships, they weren't looking for a new world. They were looking for spices. Which option does this fit with? That's right, it fits with the second option. They were responding to the demand for spices. This also rules out that they didn't expect to find spices or that they were looking for new land. And the first option isn't mentioned. So we know our answer is correct. Now for a final question, question 11. This is a function question, asking why the professor says something. We get a replay of the audio saying, here's an example, in 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. Maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time. Then it says, why does the professor say this? And the professor says, maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time. Well, the professor is saying it to demonstrate how valuable pepper was then. Which option fits with that? Yes, the third option. Even though we hear that pepper was used as a payment, it's not mentioned how common this was, nor how plentiful pepper was compared to gold. And these are not the reasons why she talks about how pepper stood at the time. Well, that's it. That's the end of today's TOEFL listening practice test. And if you'd like more practice with TOEFL listening, head to e2language.com. Here you can find lots of practice materials, methods videos, as well as mock tests, assessments, and one-on-one tutorials. Just keep practicing, and I promise you'll do great on test day.